You have brilliant ideas but struggle to get people to truly listen and act on your suggestions. Every conversation feels like pushing a boulder uphill while you watch others effortlessly influence decisions and win people over with seemingly simple words. I am Dale Carnegie, and I spent decades studying the hidden patterns of human psychology that separate those who persuade from those who merely talk. Through my research with thousands of individuals, I discovered the persuasion secrets that powerful people use instinctively but rarely share openly. What I'm about to reveal will transform how you communicate, negotiate, and influence others, giving you the same psychological advantages that the most successful people use daily. These aren't manipulation tactics, they're authentic principles of human connection that create genuine influence and lasting relationships. But first, like this video, subscribe for more life-changing insights, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready for transformation. Let me take you back to where this all began. Small farm in Missouri, where I learned my first harsh lesson about human nature. I was just a young man, convinced that intelligence and logic were all I needed to succeed in this world. How wrong I was. My father was a practical man who believed in hard work and straightforward communication. Tell people what you need, Dale, he'd say, and if it makes sense, they'll do it. This seemed reasonable enough, so I carried this philosophy with me when I left for Warrensburg State Teachers College at college. I discovered I had a talent for debate and public speaking. I could construct logical arguments, present facts clearly, and deliver them with confidence. My professors praised my analytical mind, and I graduated believing I had mastered communication. I even received my teaching certificate, which I kept as a reminder of how much I thought I knew about reaching people. But when I stepped into my first classroom, reality struck like lightning. I had 28 students who were supposed to learn mathematics from me, yet within weeks, half had mentally checked out. I would present mathematical concepts with perfect clarity, explain logical steps, and demonstrate practical applications. The information was sound, the delivery clear, yet I was losing them. One particular student, Tommy Henderson, became my wake-up call. He was bright-eyed, could see it in his eyes, but every time I tried to explain algebraic equations, he would shut down completely. I grew frustrated and made the mistake of raising my voice, thinking volume would somehow penetrate his resistance. Instead, I watched him close off entirely. After class, I found Tommy sitting alone, and something made me sit beside him instead of lecturing him again. "Tommy," I said, "what do you want to be when you grow up?" His face lit up as he told me about his dream of becoming a carpenter like his father. That's when it hit me. I had been trying to teach him mathematics, but I had never connected it to his world. The next day, I approached the same concept differently. Instead of abstract numbers, I talked about measuring lumber, calculating angles for roof construction, and determining material costs. Tommy's eyes came alive. For the first time, he wasn't learning mathematics. He was learning how to build his future. This experience shattered everything I thought I knew about communication. I realized I had been committing the cardinal sin of persuasion. I was focused entirely on what I wanted to teach, rather than what they needed to learn. I was speaking to myself, not to them. I began observing my students more carefully, and I noticed something remarkable. The students who engaged weren't necessarily the smartest, they were the ones who felt understood. When I took time to learn about their interests, dreams, and fears, they naturally became more receptive to what I had to share. This revelation extended beyond the classroom. I started experimenting with this approach in every interaction. When I needed to persuade the school board to approve new teaching materials, instead of listing educational benefits, I talked about preparing students for jobs their parents wanted. When I wanted to encourage a colleague to try a new teaching method, I framed it in terms of reducing his workload Each success taught me something new about human nature. People don't resist ideas, they resist feeling misunderstood or manipulated. They don't reject good advice, they reject advice that doesn't connect to their world. I began keeping detailed notes about these interactions, documenting what worked and what didn't. I noticed patterns emerging. Certain approaches consistently opened minds, while others closed them. I was discovering hidden rules of human psychology. That teaching certificate became a symbol of my ignorance, but also marked the beginning of my real education learning, how to reach the human heart before the mind. Asterisk, asterisk. Let me tell you about the most expensive mistake I ever made, a mistake that cost me thousands of dollars and nearly destroyed my reputation. It was 1912, and I had just moved to New York City with dreams of building a successful training business. I thought I understood persuasion because I had seen some success in Missouri, but I was about to learn a humbling lesson about human nature. I had developed what I believed was a revolutionary approach to public speaking training. My methods were sound, my curriculum was comprehensive, and my results spoke for themselves. Armed with confidence and a folder full of testimonials, I approached the largest corporation in the city to propose a company-wide training program. The meeting was with Mr. Harrison, the company's vice president of operations. I had rehearsed my presentation for weeks. I opened by explaining how my program would benefit his company: increased productivity, better employee morale, improved communication efficiency, and ultimately higher profits. I presented compelling statistics, shared success stories, and outlined a detailed implementation plan. For 30 minutes, I delivered what I considered a masterful presentation. Mr. Harrison listened politely, asked a few questions, and then delivered the words that shattered my confidence. "Mr. Carnegie, your program sounds impressive, but we're not interested at this time." I was stunned. How could he reject something so obviously beneficial? I made the fatal error of pushing harder. I re-explained the benefits, emphasized the statistics, and even offered a reduced price. With each word, I watched his expression grow colder. Finally, he stood up and said, "I believe this meeting is over." I left that office completely bewildered. For weeks, I replayed that presentation in my mind, trying to understand what went wrong. The content was solid, the delivery was confident, and the benefits were clear. What had I missed? The answer came to me during a conversation with my landlord, Mrs. Murphy. She was concerned about her son, Michael, who had been struggling to find steady work. As she described his situation, I found myself naturally asking questions. What kind of work does Michael enjoy? What are his strengths? What challenges has he faced in previous jobs? As I listened to her answers, I began to understand Michael's situation from his perspective. Only then did I offer suggestions, and they were suggestions tailored specifically to what she had told me about her son's interests and abilities. Mrs. Murphy's face lit up with gratitude. "Mr. Carnegie," she said, "you really understand Michael's situation." That's when it hit me like a thunderbolt. In my presentation to Mr. Harrison, I had spent 30 minutes talking about what I wanted to sell, but I had spent 0 minutes learning about what he needed to buy. I had made the fundamental error that destroys more potential influence than any other mistake. I had focused entirely on my agenda without first understanding his. I realized that most people approach persuasion backwards. They start with what they want and then try to convince others to want the same thing. They lead with their solution before they understand the problem. They speak before they listen. They present before they investigate. This revelation changed everything about how I approached people. I began to understand that successful persuasion isn't about having the right message. It's about delivering the right message to the right person at the right time in the right way. And you can only do that if you first understand their world, their challenges, their fears, and their desires. I started keeping a collection of my failed sales pitches and business proposals as a reminder of this principle. Each rejection taught me something new about the importance of understanding before seeking to be understood. These failures became my most valuable teachers, showing me that persuasion begins not with speaking, but with listening, not with presenting, but with investigating, not with your agenda, but with theirs. The most important business relationship of my early career began with a simple question about a man's dog. I wish I could say I was being strategic, but the truth is, I was genuinely curious about the beautiful golden retriever sitting beside his desk. It was 1913, and I was meeting with Mr. Charles Whitman, a wealthy businessman who could potentially fund my expanding training programs. I had entered his office prepared with facts, figures, and a compelling presentation. But when I saw that magnificent dog, something made me pause and ask, "What a beautiful dog. What's his name?" Mr. Whitman's entire demeanor changed. His formal business expression melted into a warm smile as he told me about Rex, how he had rescued him as a puppy, and the daily walks they took through Central Park. For 15 minutes, we talked about Rex's personality, his habits, and even his favorite treats. I found myself genuinely fascinated by the bond between this successful businessman and his canine companion. What happened next taught me one of the most powerful principles of human influence I would ever discover. When we finally turned to business, Mr. Whitman was completely receptive to everything I proposed. He approved funding that I had expected to negotiate for weeks. More importantly, he became not just a client, but a mentor and friend who supported my work for decades. That experience revealed a profound truth about human nature. People are starving for genuine interest in their lives, their passions, and their concerns. In a world where most interactions are transactional, where people are constantly trying to sell, persuade, or extract something from each other, genuine curiosity stands out like a beacon. I began experimenting with this principle systematically before every important conversation. I would research not just the business aspects of the person I was meeting, but their personal interests, hobbies, and passions. I discovered that a successful banker was passionate about orchid cultivation, so I spent an evening learning about different orchid varieties. When we met, his expertise in orchids became the foundation of our relationship. But here's the crucial distinction. Learned, this only works when the interest is genuine. People have an almost supernatural ability to detect fake curiosity. When someone asks about your interests merely to manipulate you, it feels hollow and often backfires. When someone asks because they genuinely want to understand your world, it creates an immediate connection. I developed what I called the curiosity habit. Before every interaction, I would ask myself, what can I learn about this person that would genuinely interest me? Sometimes it was their professional expertise, sometimes their hobbies, sometimes their life experiences. The key was finding something that I could authentically be curious about. This principle transformed my relationships across every area of life. I discovered that the shy bookkeeper in my building was an expert amateur astronomer. My genuine questions about constellations and planetary movements led to a friendship that lasted years. I learned that my difficult neighbor was struggling with caring for her elderly mother, and my sincere interest in her challenges turned a hostile relationship into a supportive one. The business applications were extraordinary. I found that when I genuinely cared about understanding a client's challenges, they naturally wanted to share more information. When I showed authentic interest in their industry, their company culture, their personal goals, they began to see me as a partner rather than a vendor. But the most profound discovery was how this principle changed me. When I began genuinely caring about others' interests and challenges, I became more interesting myself. I learned about orchids, astronomy, literature, engineering, family dynamics, and dozens of other subjects. Each person I met became a teacher, expanding my understanding of the world. The key to making this work is remembering that everyone is an expert in something. The secretary knows more about office dynamics than the executives. The maintenance worker understands the building better than the architect. The junior employee often has insights about customer service that senior management has forgotten. When you approach people with genuine curiosity about their expertise, their experiences, their challenges, and their perspectives, you tap into their fundamental human need to be understood and valued. This creates psychological receptivity that no amount of logical argument can achieve. People who feel understood are naturally inclined to listen, cooperate, and support those who took the time to understand them. I still have a yellowed piece of paper tucked away in my desk drawer. Thank you note from a man named Frank who changed my understanding of human dignity forever. Frank was the night janitor at the building where I held my first professional training classes, and his simple words taught me more about influence than any business book ever could. Every evening, I would stay late preparing for the next day's sessions. Frank would arrive around 10 o'clock to clean the building, and most people barely acknowledged his presence. To them, he was invisible, just part of the building's operation. But something about his quiet dignity caught my attention. One evening, I noticed Frank carefully arranging the chairs in my classroom, making sure each one was perfectly aligned. When I mentioned how much I appreciated his attention to detail, his face lit up with surprise and pride. "Most folks don't notice," he said quietly, "but I figure if people are coming here to learn, they deserve a proper setting." That comment revealed something profound about Frank's character. He understood that his work had meaning beyond simply cleaning floors and emptying trash bins. He saw himself as contributing to people's education and growth. From that moment, I made it a point to speak with Frank each evening, acknowledging his contributions and learning about his life. I discovered that Frank had been a skilled carpenter before an injury forced him to take the janitorial position. He spoke with expertise about woodworking techniques, building construction, and architectural design. His eyes would sparkle when he talked about the furniture he had crafted and the homes he had helped build. Despite his current circumstances, Frank possessed knowledge and experience that commanded respect. One evening, I was struggling with a persistent squeaking door that was disrupting my classes. Without being asked, Frank examined the hinges and explained exactly what was causing the problem and how to fix it. His solution was so elegant and practical that I asked if he would mind sharing his repair expertise with my students as a brief lesson in problem solving. The transformation in Frank was remarkable. Standing before those business professionals, explaining the mechanics of door repair with the confidence of a master craftsman, he seemed to grow taller. The students were fascinated not just by his technical knowledge, but by his thoughtful approach to diagnosing and solving problems. After the demonstration, several participants approached Frank to ask additional questions about home maintenance and repairs. That evening, Frank handed me a handwritten note that I treasured to this day. In careful script, he had written, "Mr. Carnegie, tonight you made me feel like I matter. Thank you for seeing me as more than just the man who empties your trash." Frank's note crystallized a fundamental truth about human nature. Every person carries within themselves a deep hunger to feel significant, valued, and important. This isn't vanity or ego, it's a basic human need as essential as food and shelter. When you genuinely make someone feel important, you unlock their natural desire to support and cooperate with you. I began applying this principle systematically in my business relationships. When I met with potential clients, instead of immediately launching into my presentation, I would first acknowledge their expertise, their achievements, or their insights. I would ask for their advice on challenges they understood better than I did. I would recognize their contributions to their industry or community. The results were extraordinary. A difficult executive who had been resistant to my training programs became an enthusiastic advocate after I publicly recognized his innovative management techniques during a company meeting. A skeptical department head transformed into a supporter when I genuinely praised her team's exceptional performance and asked her to share her leadership methods with other managers. But I learned an important distinction. There's a vast difference between genuine appreciation and hollow flattery. Flattery is saying something nice that isn't true or isn't meaningful. Appreciation is recognizing something valuable that someone has actually done or achieved. People can sense the difference immediately. Effective appreciation is specific, timely, and focused on things that matter to the recipient. Instead of saying "great job," I learned to say "the way you handled that difficult customer complaint showed real patience and creativity. You turned a frustrated person into a satisfied customer." Instead of generic praise, I offered specific recognition of specific achievements. I also discovered that making people feel important often means recognizing contributions that others overlook. The administrative assistant who keeps the office running smoothly, the delivery person who always arrives on time, the customer service representative who goes beyond the call of duty. These people rarely receive the recognition they deserve, making your acknowledgement even more powerful. The principle works because it addresses a fundamental asymmetry in human psychology. Most people are quick to point out mistakes, failures, and shortcomings, but slow to recognize achievements, contributions, and excellence. When you consistently focus on making others feel genuinely important and valued, you stand out in their memory as someone who sees their worth. The most important negotiation of my early career was saved by a single question, and it taught me that leading people to conclusions is infinitely more powerful than trying to force conclusions upon them. I was working with the Packard Motor Company to implement a training program for their sales force. The sales manager, a gruff man named William Porter, was convinced that his team's declining numbers were due to market conditions, not sales techniques. He had agreed to meet with me only because his boss insisted, and his resistance was palpable from the moment I entered his office. My instinct was to present the evidence, statistics showing how training had improved other companies' sales, testimonials from satisfied clients, and detailed explanations of why his current approach wasn't working. But something made me pause and try a different approach. Instead of telling Mr. Porter what was wrong with his sales process, I began asking questions. "Mr. Porter, you've been in sales longer than I have. In your experience, what separates your top performers from your average ones?" His defensive posture relaxed slightly as he began sharing his observations about his best salespeople. "What do you notice about how your top performers interact with customers differently?" I asked next. As he answered, I could see him beginning to analyze his own team's behaviors. With each question, he was discovering insights for himself rather than having them imposed by an outsider. After 20 minutes of guided questioning, Mr. Porter paused and said something that stunned me. "You know, Mr. Carnegie, I'm starting to see some patterns I hadn't noticed before. Maybe there are some techniques we could improve." He had reached the same conclusions I wanted him to reach, but because he had discovered them himself, he owned them completely. This experience taught me one of the most powerful principles of persuasion. People believe their own discoveries far more than they believe your presentations. When you tell someone something, you're asking them to trust your judgment. When you lead them to discover it themselves, they're trusting their own judgment. I began developing what I called the Socratic approach to influence. Instead of making statements, I learned to craft questions that would guide people toward the insights I wanted them to have. Instead of saying your current method isn't efficient, I would ask, how do you feel about the time it takes to complete this process? Instead of declaring you need better organization, I would inquire what would happen if you could find any document within 30 seconds. The key is asking questions that lead people to examine their own situation objectively. When someone answers a well-crafted question, they often surprise themselves with their own insights. They begin to see problems they hadn't noticed and solutions they hadn't considered. I discovered that there are different types of persuasive questions. Awareness questions help people recognize problems. How often does this issue come up? Analysis questions help them understand causes. What do you think creates this situation? Consequence questions help them see the cost of inaction. What happens if this continues? Solution questions help them envision improvement. What would it look like if this problem was solved? The beauty of this approach is that it eliminates resistance. When you tell someone their method is wrong, they naturally defend it. When you ask questions that help them evaluate their method objectively, they often reach more critical conclusions than you would have dared to suggest. I learned to sequence questions strategically, starting with easy ones that build rapport, and moving gradually toward more challenging ones that reveal problems or opportunities. Each answer creates momentum toward the conclusion you want them to reach, but because they're reaching it themselves, they embrace it enthusiastically rather than resist it defensively. I once prevented a business partnership from dissolving by spending an entire afternoon focusing on what two angry men agreed about rather than what they disagreed about. That experience taught me that building agreement creates psychological momentum that can carry people through even the most difficult disagreements. The situation involved two successful businessmen, Mr. Thompson and Mr. Davis, who had started a manufacturing company together. After 2 years of partnership, they were at each other's throats over virtually every business decision. Their lawyer had called me in as a last resort before they began expensive litigation that would have destroyed everything they had built together. When I arrived at their office, the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. They sat on opposite sides of the conference table, arms crossed, avoiding eye contact. Each man had prepared a list of grievances against the other, and they were ready for battle. My first instinct was to address their differences directly, to mediate between their opposing viewpoints and help them find compromises. But something told me that approaching their disagreements head-on would only intensify their defensiveness. Instead, I tried something counterintuitive. "Gentlemen," I said, "before we discuss where you disagree, I'm curious about what brought you together in the first place. What did you both see in this business opportunity that excited you?" The change in the room was immediate. Both men began talking about their shared vision for the company, their common belief in their product's potential, and their mutual respect for each other's expertise. For the first time in months, they were looking at each other instead of glaring. I continued, building on areas of agreement. "What do you both want for this company's future?" Again, their answers revealed shared goals: financial success, employee welfare, customer satisfaction, and personal fulfillment. "What do you both believe about how business should be conducted?" Once more, they discovered common values: integrity, quality, and fair dealing. After an hour of focusing exclusively on common ground, something remarkable happened. The hostility began to drain from the room. These two men started remembering why they had respected each other enough to become partners. They began speaking about our company and our vision instead of my position and my rights only. Then did I guide them toward their specific disagreements. But now the context had completely changed. Instead of two enemies fighting over territory, they became two partners trying to solve shared problems. Their disagreements remained the same, but their approach to resolving them was transformed. This experience taught me a fundamental principle of human psychology. Agreement creates momentum, and momentum makes people more receptive to additional agreements. When people say yes to several things in a row, they become psychologically primed to continue saying yes. when they're stuck in a pattern of no, each additional no becomes easier. I began applying this principle in every persuasive situation. Before presenting any new idea or challenging any existing belief, I would first establish multiple points of agreement. If I wanted to suggest changes to a company's training program, I would begin by acknowledging what was already working well. If I needed to challenge someone's approach, I would first affirm the principles underlying their approach. The technique works because it disarms defensiveness. When people feel attacked or criticized, they naturally become resistant to any suggestions from the attacker. But when they feel understood and appreciated first, they become curious about what else you might have to say. I learned to look for different types of common ground. Sometimes it was shared goals. We both want this project to succeed. Sometimes it was shared values. We both believe in treating customers fairly. Sometimes it was shared concerns. We both want to avoid the problems that happened last time. Sometimes it was shared experiences. We both know how challenging this industry can be. The key is being genuinely committed to finding real areas of agreement, not manufacturing false ones. People can sense when you're being manipulative, and insincere agreement building backfires quickly. But when you authentically look for shared ground, you almost always find more than you expected. I also discovered that this principle works even in situations where disagreement seems total. Even the most contentious conflicts usually involve people who share some fundamental concerns. Both sides want to be treated fairly. Both want their interests protected. Both want to find a solution that works. Starting with these basic shared desires creates a foundation for addressing more specific differences. The momentum of agreement is so powerful that it can carry people through disagreements that might otherwise be deal breakers. When people have said yes to you multiple times, they're more likely to work with you to find solutions rather than simply reject your proposals. Asterisk, the most embarrassing moment of my professional life became one of my greatest teachers about the counterintuitive power of vulnerability in building influence and trust. It was 1916, and I was scheduled to give a major presentation to the New York Business Leaders Association about modern training methods. This was my chance to establish credibility with the city's most influential business minds. I had prepared meticulously, rehearsed extensively, and felt confident about making a powerful impression. The presentation began well. I was discussing the evolution of business education when I made a bold claim about the ineffectiveness of traditional lecture-based learning. To support my point, I cited what I believed was statistics from a Harvard Business School study. As I spoke with authority about these findings, I noticed several audience members exchanging glances and whispering among themselves. During the question period, a distinguished gentleman in the front row raised his hand. "Mr. Carnegie," he said, "I'm Professor Williams from Harvard Business School, and I'm not familiar with the study you mentioned. Could you provide more details about this research?" My heart sank. In my enthusiasm to make a compelling point, I had misremembered the source of the statistics. What I had attributed to Harvard was actually from a much smaller, less credible study. I stood before New York's business elite, exposed as either incompetent or dishonest. I had two choices. I could attempt to defend my error, perhaps claiming I had misspoken or blaming my notes, or I could do something that every instinct told me would destroy my credibility. I chose the latter. "Professor Williams," I said, "I have made a significant error, and I owe this audience an apology. I incorrectly attributed those statistics to your institution when they actually came from a much smaller study with less rigorous methodology. I was so eager to support my point that I elevated the credibility of my source beyond what the facts warranted. This was careless on my part, and it's exactly the kind of imprecise thinking that undermines good business decisions." The room fell silent. I was certain I had just ended my career before it truly began. But then, something unexpected happened. Professor Williams nodded approvingly, and several other audience members began to nod as well. After the presentation, instead of the polite dismissal I expected, I was surrounded by business leaders who wanted to continue the conversation. Professor Williams himself approached me and said, "Mr. Carnegie, anyone can make a factual error, but it takes character to own it so directly. That tells me more about your integrity than any statistic could." That humiliating moment taught me one of the most powerful principles of human psychology. Admitting your mistakes before others point them out paradoxically increases rather than decreases your credibility and influence. When you acknowledge your own errors, several psychological dynamics work in your favor. First, you demonstrate intellectual honesty, which is so rare that it immediately sets you apart. Second, you show confidence only someone secure in their abilities can afford to admit imperfection. Third, you model the behavior you want from others, making them more likely to be honest with you in return. I began experimenting with strategic vulnerability in my business relationships. When proposing training programs, instead of claiming they were perfect for every situation, I would acknowledge their limitations and the types of organizations where they might not be the best fit. This honesty made my recommendations more credible, not less. When working with difficult clients, I would often begin by acknowledging mistakes I had made in similar situations previously. I've learned the hard way that assuming all employees will embrace change is a mistake, I might say. Let me share what I did wrong in a previous implementation and how we can avoid those pitfalls. The key is that admitting mistakes must be genuine and strategic. You can't admit to errors you haven't actually made, and you can't use false humility as a manipulation tactic. People sense insincerity immediately. But when you honestly acknowledge real mistakes, particularly ones that are relevant to the current situation, you create psychological safety that encourages others to be equally honest. I discovered that this principle is especially powerful when you need to correct someone else's mistake. Instead of pointing out their error directly, which triggers defensiveness, you can share a similar mistake you made previously. This allows them to recognize the parallel without feeling attacked. The most profound effect of practicing strategic vulnerability was how it changed my relationships. When I stopped pretending to be perfect, people stopped expecting perfection from me. When I showed that I could handle criticism and learn from mistakes, others became more willing to give me honest feedback. When I demonstrated that admitting errors didn't diminish my authority, I gave others permission to be equally honest about their own limitations. This principle requires courage, because it goes against every instinct about protecting your reputation. But I learned that the reputation you build through honest acknowledgement of mistakes is far more solid than the reputation you try to maintain through pretending to be flawless. I learned the hard way that the fastest way to lose an argument is to win it. The lesson came during a heated public debate that cost me a valuable business relationship and taught me that being right isn't nearly as important as maintaining the ability to influence. The incident occurred at a dinner party hosted by one of New York's prominent businessmen. The conversation turned to the effectiveness of different management approaches, and another guest, Mr. Richardson, began advocating for what I considered an outdated and harmful leadership style. He spoke with great conviction about the benefits of authoritarian management, claiming that workers needed firm control and strict oversight to be productive. Everything in me wanted to challenge his assertions directly. I had extensive experience in research showing that his approach was not only ineffective, but actually counterproductive. One knew I could demolish his arguments with facts, statistics, and examples. So that's exactly what I did. "Mr. Richardson," I said, "you're completely wrong about that approach. Modern research clearly shows that authoritarian management reduces productivity, increases turnover, and destroys morale. I can cite multiple studies that prove workers perform better under collaborative leadership styles. For the next 10 minutes, I systematically dismantled every point he had made. I presented compelling evidence, shared contradictory case studies, and demonstrated the flaws in his reasoning. By any objective measure, I won the debate decisively. But what I won in logic, I lost in relationship. Mr. Richardson's face grew red with anger and embarrassment. He became increasingly defensive, then hostile, and finally stormed out of the party. I had humiliated him in front of his peers, and he never forgave me. More importantly, he was a decision-maker at a company I had hoped to work with, and that opportunity evaporated permanently. That evening taught me a crucial lesson. When you directly contradict someone, especially in public, you force them to choose between admitting they were wrong and defending their position at all costs. Most people will choose to defend their position, even when they know it's indefensible, because their ego is now attached to being right. I began studying how to disagree without creating enemies, and I discovered that the key is never making someone feel stupid or wrong. Instead, you help them discover new information that naturally leads them to reconsider their position. The next time I encountered a similar situation, I tried a completely different approach. A potential client was explaining his belief that employee motivation was simply a matter of offering larger financial incentives. Instead of contradicting him directly, I said, "That's an interesting point, Mr. Johnson. You obviously understand the power of financial motivation. I'm curious about something. Have you ever noticed situations where people seemed motivated by things other than money?" This question didn't attack his position. It simply invited him to examine his own experiences more broadly. As he thought about it, he began sharing examples of employees who were motivated by recognition, career advancement, and personal fulfillment. Within minutes, he was discovering the limitations of his original position without my having to point them out. I developed what I came to call the yes, an approach. Instead of saying you're wrong, but ... I learned to say yes, that's one way to look at it, and here's another perspective to consider ... This language acknowledges their viewpoint as valid within its context, while introducing additional information. Another technique I mastered was the agreeable disagreement. When someone made a statement I disagreed with, I would find some element of truth in it and acknowledge that first. You're absolutely right that financial incentives can be powerful motivators. I've seen that work in many situations. I've also noticed that sometimes other factors can be equally powerful. ... Double quotes. The key is timing and tone. You must genuinely acknowledge the validity of their perspective before introducing alternative viewpoints. If your acknowledgement feels perfunctory or insincere, the technique backfires. But when you authentically recognize the merit in their position, people become remarkably open to considering additional perspectives. I also learned the power of questions in avoiding direct contradiction. Instead of saying, "That won't work," I learned to ask, "What do you think might happen if we tried that approach?" Instead of declaring, "That's impossible," I would inquire what would need to be true for that to be feasible. These questions engage their analytical mind rather than their defensive reflexes. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that you can often achieve your persuasive goals without ever proving the other person wrong. Sometimes it's enough to plant seeds of doubt or introduce new information. Sometimes it's better to let them save face by claiming they've evolved their thinking rather than admitting they were mistaken. The principle works because it preserves dignity while opening minds. When people feel respected and understood, they're naturally curious about your perspective. When they feel attacked or belittled, they become focused on defending themselves rather than learning from you. The goal isn't to win debates, it's to influence outcomes while maintaining relationships. One of the most delicate influence challenges I ever faced involved helping a company president reverse a public decision without losing credibility with his board of directors. The solution taught me that preserving someone's dignity while changing their mind is not just good manners, it's essential for lasting influence. The situation arose when Mr. Harrison, president of a mid-sized manufacturing company, had announced a major restructuring plan during the annual shareholders meeting. The plan was well-intentioned but fundamentally flawed, and it was already causing serious problems with employee morale and operational efficiency. Several board members had privately expressed concern, but no one wanted to directly challenge Mr. Harrison's judgment in front of the entire organization. The board quietly asked me to help them address the situation. The challenge was enormous. How do you help someone change course when they've publicly committed to a specific direction, especially when their reputation and authority are tied to that decision? My first instinct was to present Mr. Harrison with evidence showing why his plan wasn't working. I could have arranged meetings with affected employees, compiled data demonstrating the problems, and built a compelling case for change. But I realized that this approach would force him to choose between admitting he was wrong and stubbornly defending a failing strategy. Instead, I arranged a private conversation and tried a completely different approach. Mr. Harrison, I began, I've been observing the implementation of your restructuring plan, and I'm impressed by how you've been adapting it as new information emerges. That kind of flexibility is what separates good leaders from great ones. He looked puzzled. What do you mean about adapting? I haven't made any significant changes. Well, I continued, I noticed that you've been gathering feedback from various departments and really listening to what people are telling you. That shows the kind of responsive leadership that allows plans to evolve and improve over time. I was giving him credit for being the kind of leader who adjusts course based on new information, even though he hadn't actually done so yet. But something interesting happened. He began to see himself in this role I was describing. You know, he said slowly, I have been hearing some concerns from different areas of the company. I've been wondering if there might be ways to refine certain aspects of the implementation. From there, I was able to guide him through a process of refining his plan based on the additional insights he had gathered since the original announcement. Each modification moved further away from the problematic original plan and closer to a workable solution. But instead of reversing his decision, he was improving it. Instead of admitting failure, he was demonstrating responsive leadership. When Mr. Harrison announced the modifications to his plan, he framed them as evolutionary improvements based on early implementation learnings. As we've begun rolling out our restructuring initiative, he told the board, we've gathered valuable feedback that allows us to enhance our approach and ensure even better outcomes. The board was relieved, the employees were satisfied, and Mr. Harrison's reputation for thoughtful leadership was actually enhanced rather than damaged. He had completely changed direction while appearing to stay the course. This experience taught me a fundamental principle about human psychology. People need pathways to change their minds without losing face. When you corner someone and force them to admit they were wrong, they'll often choose to be wrong rather than be humiliated. But when you provide them with face-saving ways to evolve their position, they'll often embrace change eagerly. I began developing what I called dignity-preserving influence techniques. Instead of asking people to abandon their positions, I learned to help them enhance, refine, or evolve their positions. Instead of requiring them to admit mistakes, I enabled them to claim they were incorporating new information or responding to changed circumstances. The key language patterns I discovered were phrases like building on your insight, taking your idea to the next level, refining your approach, and incorporating new developments. These phrases allowed people to change direction while maintaining their sense of competence and consistency. I also learned the power of time in preserving dignity. Instead of asking for immediate changes, I would often plant seeds of new thinking and then revisit the topic later, giving people time to internalize new perspectives and claim ownership of evolved positions. Another crucial technique was providing external factors that justified change, given the new information that's emerged, or considering the changing market conditions, These phrases allowed people to adjust their positions in response to external circumstances rather than internal errors. The principle applies to every level of influence, from personal relationships to major business decisions. When your spouse wants to change vacation plans, help them discover new advantages, rather than criticizing the original choice. When an employee needs to alter their approach, focus on additional benefits rather than current problems. The most profound insight I gained was that preserving dignity isn't just about being nice, it's about being effective. When people can change their minds without losing face, they're more likely to change. When they feel their competence and judgment are under attack, they become committed to defending positions they might otherwise abandon. The most successful business transformation I ever witnessed happened because I learned to let other people create the solution instead of trying to impose my own. The experience taught me that people don't resist change, they resist being changed. I was working with a textile company whose productivity had been declining for months. The owner, Mr. Davidson, was frustrated because he had implemented what he considered excellent efficiency improvements, but the workers seemed to be sabotaging every change. Morale was terrible, turnover was increasing, and productivity continued to drop despite obviously beneficial modifications to the workflow. Mr. Davidson had consulted efficiency experts, studied successful factories, and implemented proven systems. On paper, everything should have worked perfectly. In reality, the workers resented every change and found ways to circumvent the new procedures. The harder management pushed, the more resistance they encountered. When Mr. Davidson asked for my help, my first instinct was to analyze the situation and recommend better implementation strategies. But instead, I suggested something that seemed counterproductive. Abandon the current changes and ask the workers themselves to identify problems and propose solutions. Mr. Davidson was skeptical. These workers don't understand business efficiency, he protested. They're not trained in industrial engineering. How can they design better systems than the experts I hired? I convinced him to try an experiment. We organized a series of meetings where workers could discuss the challenges they faced in their daily tasks. Instead of presenting solutions, we simply asked questions. What slows you down during your shift? What tools or materials do you have to wait for? What would make your job easier and more efficient? The results were remarkable. The workers identified problems that the efficiency experts had missed entirely. They pointed out bottlenecks in the supply chain that outsiders couldn't see. They suggested workflow modifications that were far more practical than the theoretical improvements the consultants had recommended. More importantly, because the workers were identifying problems and proposing solutions, they felt ownership of the changes. Instead of resisting modifications imposed from above, they became advocates for improvements they had suggested themselves. One worker, Maria, proposed reorganizing the supply station to reduce walking time between materials. Another, James, suggested a different sequence for certain tasks that eliminated waiting periods. Tom recommended a simple tool modification that sped up a recurring procedure. Each suggestion was evaluated by the group, refined through discussion, and implemented with the involvement of the person who had proposed it. Within 6 weeks, productivity had increased beyond what any of the external consultants had projected, and worker satisfaction had improved dramatically. The transformation happened because we had shifted from imposing change to facilitating change. Instead of telling people what to do differently, we helped them discover what they wanted to do differently. Instead of making them feel incompetent, we made them feel valuable and intelligent. This experience revealed a fundamental principle of human psychology. People support what they help create. When you involve others in developing solutions, they become psychologically invested in making those solutions work. When you exclude them from the creation process, they become emotionally detached from the results. I began applying this principle in every influence situation. When I wanted a client to adopt a new training program, instead of presenting a completed proposal, I would involve them in designing the program. What specific challenges do you think this training should address? What outcomes would make you consider it successful? What format would work best for your employees? By the time we finished the collaborative design process, they felt like co-creators of the program rather than passive recipients of my recommendations. Their commitment to success was far stronger because their fingerprints were all over the solution. The technique works in personal relationships as well. When I wanted my family to change our vacation plans, instead of announcing the change, I involved them in evaluating options and making decisions. When they participated in choosing the alternative, they were excited about it, rather than disappointed about the original plan being cancelled. The key is genuine participation, not token consultation. People can sense when their input is actually influencing decisions versus when they're being manipulated into supporting predetermined conclusions. Real participation means being willing to incorporate their ideas, even when they're different from what you initially envisioned. I learned to ask questions that genuinely opened up the solution space. What if we approached this completely differently? What would the ideal outcome look like from your perspective? What resources would you need to make this work? These questions invited real creativity and ownership rather than just agreement with existing plans. The most powerful aspect of this principle is that it often produces better solutions than you could have developed alone. When you involve people who will be affected by decisions, you gain access to information and perspectives that you couldn't have obtained otherwise. Their practical knowledge, combined with their psychological investment, creates both better solutions and stronger commitment to implementation. Discovered the extraordinary power of appealing to people's better angels during a crisis that tested everything I believed about human motivation. The situation taught me that most people are hungry to see themselves as honorable, principled, and worthy of respect, and that hunger can be your most powerful ally in influence. The crisis occurred when I was asked to help resolve a labor dispute at a steel manufacturing plant. The workers had been on strike for 3 weeks. The company was losing thousands of dollars daily, and negotiations had reached a bitter stalemate. Both sides were entrenched in adversarial positions, focusing entirely on what they could get rather than what they could give. The union representatives painted the company as greedy and exploitative. The management portrayed the workers as unreasonable and ungrateful. Each side seemed determined to prove the other was selfish and wrong. Traditional negotiation tactics had failed completely. When I met separately with both groups, I tried a different approach. Instead of focusing on their grievances or their demands, I talked about their values and their character. With the workers, I didn't discuss wages or working conditions. Instead, I talked about their pride in craftsmanship, their commitment to supporting their families, and their role in building America's industrial strength. You men are the backbone of American manufacturing, I told them. Your skills and dedication create the steel that builds our cities and defends our nation. You have a responsibility not just to yourselves and your families, but to the entire community that depends on this plant. With management, I took a similar approach. Instead of discussing profit margins or operational efficiency, I talked about their responsibility as stewards of the community's economic well-being, their role in providing stable employment for hundreds of families, and their opportunity to demonstrate enlightened leadership. You have the chance to show that American business can succeed while treating workers with dignity and respect, I told them. The way you handle this situation will be remembered long after the specific details are forgotten. Something remarkable happened when I reframed the conflict in terms of higher purposes rather than competing interests. Both sides began to see themselves not as adversaries fighting over a limited pie, but as partners working toward shared noble goals: community prosperity, family security, industrial excellence, and American strength. The union representatives started talking about their responsibility to be reasonable and forward-thinking, not just for their own members, but for the future of American labor relations. The management team began discussing their obligation to set an example of enlightened business practices that other companies could follow. Within a week, they had reached an agreement that neither side had considered possible when they were focused solely on their own immediate interests. Both groups felt good about the resolution because they could see themselves as having acted on principle rather than mere self-interest. This experience taught me that most people genuinely want to do the right thing, but they need help connecting their actions to their values. When you appeal to someone's noble motives, their desire to be fair, honorable, generous, or principled, you give them powerful reasons to support your position that go beyond simple self-interest. I began incorporating this principle into all my influence efforts. When I wanted a business leader to invest in employee development, I didn't just talk about improved productivity and reduced turnover. I talked about their opportunity to transform lives, develop human potential, and build a legacy of enlightened leadership. When I needed a wealthy donor to support educational programs, I didn't focus only on tax benefits or public recognition. I emphasized their chance to break cycles of poverty, create opportunities for deserving young people, and contribute to America's intellectual and moral development. The key is identifying genuine noble motives that are authentic to the person you're trying to influence. A business executive might be motivated by ideals of fair competition and market leadership. A teacher might respond to appeals about shaping future generations. A parent might be moved by considerations of setting good examples for their children. The motives must be real, not manufactured. People can sense when you're trying to manipulate them with false appeals to virtue. But when you help them connect their actions to their genuine values and aspirations, you tap into a source of motivation that is far more powerful than fear, greed, or self-interest alone. I also learned that noble motives often resolve apparent conflicts between personal benefit and ethical behavior. When people can see how doing the right thing also serves their legitimate interests, they feel good about pursuing both objectives simultaneously. The principle works because it allows people to feel proud of their decisions rather than merely satisfied with them. When someone can tell themselves and others that they acted on principle, they become advocates for their decision rather than just passive participants in it. The most memorable presentation I ever gave involved a broken clock, a bill, and a lesson about timing that transformed how I thought about making ideas stick in people's minds. That experience taught me that showing is infinitely more powerful than telling, and that dramatic demonstrations create lasting impressions that words alone never can. I was speaking to a group of business executives about the importance of timing in decision-making. I had prepared a logical presentation with statistics, case studies, and expert quotes. My argument was sound, my evidence was compelling, and my delivery was polished. But I could see in their faces that familiar, glazed look of people hearing information they would forget within hours. Halfway through my presentation, I noticed an old broken clock sitting on the bookshelf behind the conference table. Suddenly, I abandoned my prepared remarks and picked up that clock. "Gentlemen," I said, holding up the timepiece, "this clock is worthless. Not because it's broken you can fix a broken clock. This clock is worthless because it's not just broken, it's obsolete." While this clock sat on that shelf being ignored, the world moved on to better ways of keeping time. I paused and pulled out a $20 bill. I'll give this $20 to anyone who can tell me what time this clock shows. Several men examined it and gave me the time displayed on its frozen hands. Excellent, I said, but here's the problem. I pulled out my pocket watch. This clock says it's 3:17, but the real time is 4:42. This clock isn't just broken, it's wrong. And in business, being consistently wrong is worse than being obviously broken, because broken things get fixed, while wrong things get trusted. I let that sink in before continuing. How many decisions in your business are being made based on information that's like this clock, not obviously broken, but quietly wrong? How many strategies are built on data that was accurate last year, but misleading today? The room was completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Then I delivered the final point. The companies that succeed aren't necessarily the ones with the best clocks. They're the ones that check their clocks most often against reality. That 5-minute demonstration accomplished what my presentation could never have achieved. 6 months later, executives from that meeting were still referencing the clock principle when discussing strategic decisions. They remembered the lesson not because of my words, but because of what they had seen and experienced. This experience revolutionized my approach to communication. I realized that our minds are wired to remember experiences far better than explanations. When you tell someone something, you're asking them to trust your words. When you show them something, you're giving them their own experience to remember. I began incorporating dramatic demonstrations into every important presentation. When I wanted to illustrate the power of first impressions, I would enter the room dressed professionally, deliver a brief, eloquent introduction, then step outside and return wearing a rumpled jacket and speaking carelessly. The contrast was immediate and unforgettable. When teaching about the importance of clear communication, I would ask someone to give directions to a location while everyone else had their eyes closed. Then ask them to give the same directions while drawing a simple map. The difference in comprehension was obvious to everyone in the room. The key to effective dramatic demonstration is making the experience directly relevant to your message. The demonstration shouldn't be a gimmick or attention getter. It should be the message itself, expressed through action rather than words. Learned that the most powerful demonstrations often involve the audience directly. Instead of showing them something, I would create situations where they discovered principles for themselves. When teaching about the difficulty of changing habits, I would ask everyone to clasp their hands together, then try to clasp them with the opposite thumb on top. The immediate discomfort everyone felt illustrated the principle more vividly than any lecture could. Physical props became essential tools in my presentations. A simple rope could demonstrate the strength that comes from unity. A house of cards could show the fragility of complex systems. A mirror could illustrate the importance of self-awareness in leadership. The principle extends beyond formal presentations to everyday influence situations. When I wanted to convince a client to invest in better employee training, instead of just discussing the benefits, I arranged for them to observe a brief training session and see the immediate improvement in performance. When helping someone understand the cost of poor communication in their organization, I would track specific examples of miscommunication and present them with documentation of the time and money lost. Seeing concrete examples was far more persuasive than hearing abstract arguments. The most important insight I gained was that memorable experiences create emotional connections to ideas, and emotional connections drive decisions far more effectively than logical arguments. When people feel something in addition to understanding it, they're much more likely to act on it. Dramatic demonstrations work because they engage multiple senses and create what psychologists call episodic memories. Memories tied to specific experiences that are much more durable than semantic memories of abstract information. People might forget your statistics, but they'll remember what they saw, felt, and experienced ****. The true power of these persuasion principles revealed itself during the most challenging influence situation of my career, negotiation that required me to orchestrate all 10 secrets simultaneously, to prevent a corporate merger that would have destroyed thousands of jobs. The situation involved a struggling railroad company that a larger corporation wanted to acquire, dismantle, and sell for parts. The board of directors was leaning toward accepting the offer because they felt they had no alternative. My task was to convince them that there was another path, but I had only one meeting to make my case before they voted. This wasn't a situation where I could use 1 or 2 influence techniques. I needed every principle working in harmony to create an irresistible case for a different direction. Let me walk you through how I orchestrated these secrets together. I began with genuine interest in their situation, spending the first 15 minutes asking detailed questions about the challenges they faced, the pressures they were under, and the concerns that kept them awake at night. This wasn't strategic politeness. I genuinely wanted to understand their world before attempting to change their minds as they shared their concerns. I made sure each board member felt important by acknowledging their expertise and the weight of responsibility they carried. Mr. Thompson, your 40 years in this industry give you insights that few people possess. Ms. Rodriguez, your financial analysis clearly shows the depth of thought you've put into this decision. Instead of telling them their merger plan was wrong, I asked questions that led them to examine their assumptions. What would need to be true for this company to become profitable again? If you had unlimited resources, what would you change first? What assets does this company have that might be more valuable than the current numbers suggest? I found common ground by acknowledging their shared commitment to the company's legacy, their concern for employees, and their fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. We all want what's best for this company and everyone it affects. We all understand the gravity of this decision and the need to act responsibly. When I needed to challenge their assumptions, I admitted my own past mistakes first. I once advised a company to take what seemed like the safe path, and I learned later that we had overlooked opportunities that could have transformed the business. I don't want to see another group of leaders have that regret. I carefully avoided direct contradiction, instead using phrases like "that's certainly one way to approach it," and "I wonder if there might be additional options worth considering." This preserved their dignity while opening space for alternative thinking. Throughout our discussion, I helped them save face by framing any course correction as evolution rather than reversal. Your thorough analysis of the merger option has actually positioned you perfectly to evaluate alternative strategies with the same rigor. I involved them in developing the alternative solution by asking them to help design what a turnaround strategy might look like. Given your collective expertise, what would you change if you decided to fight for this company's future? By the end of our discussion, they felt like co-creators of the alternative plan rather than passive recipients of my recommendations. I appealed to their noble motives by connecting their decision to their legacy as leaders and their responsibility to the community. You have the opportunity to show that American business leaders can create value instead of just extracting it, that they can build rather than just liquidate. Finally, I created a dramatic demonstration by bringing in 3 former employees who had started successful businesses after learning skills during their railroad careers. These men stood before the board and testified to the company's hidden value as a developer of human talent. "This company doesn't just move freight," one said, "it builds people who build America." The effect of combining all these principles was extraordinary. By the end of our 3-hour meeting, the board had not only rejected the merger, but committed to a comprehensive turnaround plan. More importantly, they were excited about the challenge instead of resigned to failure. 6 months later, the company was profitable again. 2 years later, It was more valuable than the original merger offer. But the real victory was watching board members who had felt defeated become leaders who felt empowered. This experience taught me that these principles aren't just individual techniques, they're components of a comprehensive approach to ethical influence. When you use them together systematically, they create a compelling psychological environment where people naturally want to consider your perspective and collaborate on solutions. The key to integration is understanding that each principle amplifies the others. Genuine interest makes people more receptive to feeling important. Making people feel important increases their willingness to engage with your questions. Questions that lead to self-discovery create momentum for finding common ground. Common ground makes it easier to admit mistakes and avoid contradiction. Preserving dignity encourages participation. Participation creates ownership. Noble motives inspire commitment, and dramatic demonstrations make everything memorable. The result is influence that feels natural rather than manipulative, collaborative rather than coercive, and empowering rather than diminishing. When you master the integration of these principles, you don't just change minds, you transform relationships and create lasting positive change. The ultimate test of these persuasion principles came when I encountered the most difficult person I ever tried to influence, a man so hostile, stubborn, and unreasonable that other consultants had refused to work with him. The experience taught me how to adapt these techniques for extreme situations and impossible people. His name was Marcus Brennan, and he was the owner of a successful but chaotic manufacturing company. His employees feared him, his managers avoided him, and his customers tolerated him only because his products were exceptional. Marcus had hired and fired 3 consultants in 6 months, each time declaring that they were incompetent fools who didn't understand his business. When his lawyer asked me to help improve the company's management systems, I almost declined. Everyone warned me that Marcus was impossible to work with, arrogant, explosive, and convinced that everyone around him was an idiot. But I was curious to see if my principles could work even in such extreme circumstances. My first meeting with Marcus confirmed every warning I had received. He was belligerent from the moment I entered his office, interrupting my introduction to declare that consultants were parasites who made money by telling people what they already knew. He spent 20 minutes explaining why every suggestion anyone had ever made was stupid, impractical, or evidence of complete ignorance about his industry. Traditional influence approaches would have failed immediately. I couldn't compliment him, he would have seen it as manipulation. I couldn't ask about his interests, he would have suspected ulterior motives. I couldn't find common ground, he was determined to disagree with everything. I needed to adapt my principles for someone actively hostile to influence. I started with extreme genuine interest, but not in his opinions or his business. Instead, I became fascinated by his expertise. "Mr. Brennan," I said, "I've been studying manufacturing efficiency for years, but I've never met someone who understands the practical challenges as deeply as you obviously do. I'm curious, what do most consultants miss when they try to improve operations like yours?" This question was carefully crafted. It acknowledged his expertise, validated his negative experiences with consultants, and invited him to educate me, rather than trying to educate him. For the first time in our conversation, he seemed genuinely engaged rather than defensive, as he explained the mistakes other consultants had made. I listened with authentic fascination and asked follow-up questions that demonstrated I understood the complexity of his challenges. I never agreed or disagreed, simply sought to understand his perspective completely. After an hour of this approach, something remarkable happened. His hostility began to fade. He was still gruff and demanding, but he was no longer treating me as an enemy. He had begun to see me as someone who might actually understand his world. When I needed to introduce new ideas, I used an adapted version of the question technique. Instead of asking, "What if you tried this approach?" which would have triggered his defensiveness, I asked, "What would someone need to understand about your operation before they could suggest meaningful improvements?" This question made him the expert and me the student, which was the only relationship dynamic he could accept for face saving. I developed what I called hostile environment language. Instead of suggesting that anything he was doing was wrong, I talked about challenges that even the best operations face and opportunities that might be hidden in successful systems. This language allowed him to consider changes without admitting flaws. The breakthrough came when I involved him in solving other companies' problems. I described challenges that similar businesses faced and asked for his advice. As he developed solutions for these other companies, he was actually designing improvements for his own operation. When he later implemented these ideas, they were his solutions to other people's problems, not my solutions to his problems. To appeal to his noble motives, I had to identify what he actually cared about beyond himself. Through careful observation, I discovered that despite his difficult personality, he took genuine pride in the quality of his products and the craftsmanship of his workers. I began framing suggestions in terms of enabling even higher quality and showcasing his workers' skills. For dramatic demonstrations, I had to be extremely subtle. Marcus would have rejected obvious theatrics, so I arranged for him to observe problems and solutions in action without realizing I was orchestrating the experience. When he discovered efficiency improvements himself, he embraced them enthusiastically. The most important adaptation was patience. With most people, you can see results from these principles within minutes or hours. With someone like Marcus, progress was measured in weeks and months. I had to be willing to invest enormous time in building trust before attempting any significant influence. After 6 months of this approach, Marcus had implemented more changes than any of his previous consultants had even suggested. More importantly, his relationships with employees had improved dramatically because he felt less defensive and more collaborative. The experience taught me that these principles work even with extremely difficult people, but they require significant adaptation and patience. You must be willing to work within their psychological constraints rather than trying to change those constraints directly. You must earn the right to influence through demonstrated understanding and respect, even when that respect isn't initially reciprocated. The key insight was that difficult people aren't immune to these principles. They're just more sensitive to insincerity and more resistant to traditional approaches. When you adapt your methods to work within their defenses rather than trying to overcome those defenses, even the most challenging personalities can become collaborators rather than adversaries. Asterisk. The moment I realized the dangerous power of these principles came when I watched a student use them to manipulate people for purely selfish purposes. That experience forced me to confront the ethical responsibilities that come with understanding human psychology and to develop guidelines that separate influence from manipulation. The student was a man named Robert who had attended my training sessions and learned the techniques with remarkable speed. He was charming, intelligent, and seemed genuinely interested in improving his ability to work with others. What I didn't realize was that he was planning to use these principles to deceive investors in a fraudulent business scheme. Within months of completing my program, Robert had convinced several wealthy individuals to invest their life savings in a company that existed only on paper. He used genuine interest to learn about their dreams and fears, made them feel important by treating them as sophisticated investors, asked questions that led them to convince themselves the opportunity was legitimate, and appealed to their noble desire to support American innovation. When the fraud was discovered and Robert was arrested, several of his victims contacted me. They wanted to understand how they had been so thoroughly deceived by someone they had trusted completely. The pain in their voices haunted me for months and forced me to examine the ethical implications of everything I was teaching. That crisis led me to develop what I call the Mentor's Code of Ethics, a set of principles that guide the responsible use of influence techniques. The foundation of this code is a simple question: am I using these principles to create mutual benefit, or am I using them to extract value from others? Ethical influence always seeks win-win outcomes. When you use these techniques responsibly, both parties benefit from the interaction. The person being influenced gets something they genuinely need or want, and you achieve your legitimate objectives. Manipulation, by contrast, benefits only the manipulator at the expense of the other person. The difference lies not just in the outcome, but in the intention. When I help a business leader understand the benefits of investing in employee development, I'm genuinely convinced that this investment will benefit both the employees and the business. When Robert convinced investors to fund his non-existent company, he knew they would lose everything while he gained their money. Another crucial distinction is honesty about your motives. Ethical influence requires being transparent about what you hope to achieve from the interaction. You don't have to reveal your entire strategy, but you should be honest about your basic objectives. If someone asked me directly why I was asking certain questions or showing particular interest, I could answer truthfully without undermining my effectiveness. I learned to regularly examine my own motives by asking myself several questions. Would I be comfortable if this person knew exactly what I was trying to accomplish? Would I feel good about this interaction if our roles were reversed? Am I helping this person make a decision that's truly in their best interest, or am I just convincing them to do what I want? The ethical use of these principles also requires respecting people's right to say no. When you influence someone ethically, you're helping them make a better decision, not forcing them to make the decision you prefer. If someone understands your proposition clearly and still chooses to decline, ethical influence means accepting that decision gracefully. I also establish the principle of proportionality. The effort you put into influencing someone should be proportional to the mutual benefit of the outcome. It's appropriate to use sophisticated influence techniques when you're helping someone make a major decision that will significantly benefit both of you. It's manipulative to use the same techniques to get someone to do small favors that primarily benefit you. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that ethical influence requires ongoing respect for the person's autonomy and dignity. Even when you successfully influence someone's decision, you should continue to treat them as an equal partner rather than as someone you've conquered or controlled. The long-term test of ethical influence is whether the relationship remains strong after the immediate objective is achieved. When you influence people ethically, they remain grateful for your guidance even after they understand how you influenced them. When you manipulate people, they feel used and betrayed once they recognize what happened. These ethical guidelines aren't just moral niceties, they're practical necessities. Unethical influence creates enemies, destroys trust, and ultimately undermines your ability to influence anyone. Ethical influence builds relationships, creates advocates, and establishes a reputation that makes future influence easier and more effective. The responsibility that comes with understanding these principles is profound. You have the ability to significantly impact other people's decisions and lives. Using that ability wisely and ethically isn't just the right thing to do, it's the only way to build lasting success and genuine satisfaction from your influence. Mastering these persuasion principles isn't something that happens overnight through understanding alone. It requires deliberate, consistent practice that transforms intellectual knowledge into intuitive skill. The system I developed for building these abilities came from my own journey of turning theoretical concepts into practical expertise. For years, I kept a daily practice journal where I recorded every significant interaction and analyzed what worked, what didn't, and what I could improve. This journal became my laboratory for developing influence skills, and the patterns I discovered transformed my understanding of how to build persuasive ability systematically. The first lesson I learned was that you must practice these principles in low-stakes situations before attempting to use them in high-stakes ones. I began with casual conversations, asking the grocery clerk about their day with genuine interest, making the postal worker feel important by acknowledging their efficiency, using questions instead of statements when discussing dinner plans. With my family, these everyday interactions became my training ground. I discovered that showing authentic interest in a waiter's recommendations led to better service and more enjoyable meals. Making a taxi driver feel important by asking about their knowledge of the city resulted in fascinating conversations and insider tips about the best routes and destinations. Each small success built my confidence and refined my technique. I learned that genuine interest couldn't be faked, had to be cultivated as a real curiosity about other people's experiences and perspectives. I developed what I called curiosity habits, training myself to notice interesting details about people and situations that I might naturally overlook. For building the skill of making others feel important, I created daily challenges for myself. I would set a goal of giving at least 3 genuine compliments or acknowledgements each day, but they had to be specific and meaningful rather than generic. Instead of saying "nice job," I practiced saying "the way you handled that difficult." Customers showed real patience and professionalism. To develop my questioning skills, I practiced turning statements into questions in conversations with friends and family. Instead of saying "that restaurant is too expensive," I learned to ask "how do you feel about the prices at that restaurant?" This simple shift changed the entire dynamic of discussions, making them more collaborative and less confrontational. I measured my progress by tracking specific outcomes. How often did people seem genuinely engaged in conversations with me? How frequently did people ask for my advice or seek my opinion? How many times did someone change their mind after discussing something with me? These metrics helped me understand which techniques were becoming natural and which still needed work. One of the most valuable exercises I developed was what I called influence observation. I would watch other people's interactions in business meetings, social gatherings, even overheard conversations, and analyze which persuasion principles were being used effectively or missed entirely. This passive observation helped me recognize patterns and opportunities without the pressure of performing. I also practiced reverse engineering successful influence attempts. When someone effectively persuaded me to change my mind or take action, I would analyze exactly what they had done. Which principles had they used? What made their approach compelling? How could I adapt their techniques for my own situations? For developing the more advanced skills, like finding common ground and preserving dignity, I sought out deliberately challenging practice opportunities. I would engage in discussions with people who held strongly different political or social views, focusing entirely on finding shared values and concerns rather than trying to change their positions. These practice sessions taught me that common ground always exists if you look deep enough. Even people with opposite political views usually share concerns about family security, community welfare, and personal freedom. Learning to identify and articulate these shared foundations became a crucial skill for more difficult influence situations. I discovered that the key to rapid improvement was getting feedback on my attempts. I began asking trusted friends and colleagues to help me analyze important conversations and negotiations. What did you notice about how I handled that disagreement? When did the other person seem most receptive? What opportunities did I miss? This feedback revealed blind spots I couldn't see myself. I learned that I sometimes rushed to my point before adequately demonstrating understanding. I discovered that my body language occasionally contradicted my words when I was trying to show genuine interest. I found that I was better at some principles than others and needed to focus my practice accordingly. The most important insight from my practice journal was that these skills compound over time. Early attempts felt awkward and calculated, but with consistent practice, they became natural and automatic. More importantly, as people began responding more positively to my influence attempts, my confidence grew, which made the techniques even more effective. After several years of deliberate practice, I noticed that I no longer needed to consciously choose which principles to use in different situations. My mind naturally assessed each interaction and applied the appropriate techniques without conscious effort. The skills had become intuitive rather than intellectual. The practice never truly ends because every interaction offers opportunities to refine these abilities. Even decades later, I continue to notice subtle improvements in my effectiveness and new applications for these timeless principles. The goal isn't perfection, it's continuous improvement in your ability to connect with others and create positive outcomes through ethical influence. Asterisk. As I reflect on a lifetime of studying and teaching these principles, I'm struck by a profound realization. The ultimate measure of your influence isn't what you accomplish for yourself, but what you enable others to accomplish for themselves and the world around them. Throughout my career, I've had the privilege of watching thousands of people transform their relationships, their careers, and their communities by applying these persuasion principles ethically and effectively. But the stories that fill me with the greatest pride aren't about business deals closed or personal objectives achieved. They're about human potential unleashed and positive change multiplied through the ripple effects of ethical influence. I think of Sarah, a young teacher who learned to use genuine interest and appreciation to reach troubled students that other educators had given up on. Those students didn't just improve their grades, they discovered their own worth and went on to become productive citizens who now inspire others. Sarah's influence created a cascade of positive impact that continues decades later. I remember Thomas, a factory supervisor who applied these principles to transform a hostile workplace into a collaborative environment where workers felt valued and important. Productivity increased, but more importantly, hundreds of families experienced less stress and more happiness because their breadwinner came home energized rather than defeated each day. Asterisk. There was Margaret, a community organizer who used these techniques to bring together people from different backgrounds and opposing viewpoints to solve local problems. Her ability to find common ground and preserve dignity during disagreements helped heal divisions that had plagued her town for generations. These stories illustrate a truth I've come to understand deeply. When you use influence to empower others rather than diminish them, when you help people discover their own capabilities rather than making them dependent on you, when you create win-win outcomes rather than zero-sum victories, you contribute to a more collaborative and compassionate world. The principles I've shared with you are not merely techniques for getting what you want. They're tools for creating the kind of relationships and communities that make life richer for everyone involved. When you show genuine interest in others, you help them feel valued and understood in a world that often ignores them. When you make people feel important, you remind them of their own worth and potential. When you preserve their dignity while helping them change, you model the kind of respect that makes positive transformation possible. But with this power comes profound responsibility. Every time you influence someone, you're shaping not just that immediate interaction, but potentially their future relationships and their own approach to influence. When you use these principles ethically, you're teaching by example. When you use them to manipulate or exploit, you're contributing to a more cynical and hostile world. I encourage you to think beyond your immediate objectives and consider the long-term impact of your influence. Ask yourself, what kind of world am I creating through my interactions? Am I making people more trusting or more suspicious, more collaborative or more defensive, more optimistic about human nature, or more cynical. The most rewarding aspect of mastering ethical influence is discovering that you don't have to choose between achieving your goals and helping others achieve theirs. When you become skilled at creating genuine win-win outcomes, you find that your own success accelerates because people naturally want to work with and support someone who consistently helps them succeed. As you begin applying these principles in your own life, remember that mastery takes time and your influence will grow gradually. Start with small interactions and low-stakes situations. Focus on genuine service to others rather than personal gain. Measure your success not just by what you accomplish, but by how people feel after interacting with you. Most importantly, teach these principles to others. Share what you learn, model ethical influence in your daily interactions, and help create a culture where people influence each other through understanding and respect rather than pressure and manipulation. The world needs more people who understand how to bring out the best in others, who can find common ground across differences, who can create collaboration instead of conflict. It needs people who can influence without dominating, persuade without deceiving, and lead without diminishing those who follow. You now possess tools that can transform not just your own effectiveness, but the quality of every relationship you have and every community you're part of. Use them wisely, use them ethically, and use them to leave the world a little better than you found it. That, ultimately, is the true power and purpose of influence. Not to get what you want from the world, but to give what the world needs from you. Your journey of ethical influence begins now. Make it count.